A self-made couple making plans for the next stage of their lives.
They were getting ready to have a quiet retirement.
They were such a beautiful couple. They would give you your shirt off their back.
They had a lot of friends and loved spending time with family.
Gunned down, execution style, in their own home.
It just seemed to make no sense. Who would do that, and what could possibly be the motive?
While searching for the killer, investigators uncover a world of greed and deceit.
We looked at desperation. She was desperate for money.
He felt he had been treated badly, basically kicked to the curb.
People were saying that he was very upset. It certainly is motive.
A series of chilling discoveries.
We learned that he was receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Everything he's told us is a lie.
Points to a killer no one ever imagined.
People were shocked.
It shows what a messed up psyche he's got.
It was unbelievable how somebody can be that cold-blooded.
On the outskirts of La Crosse, Wisconsin, lies the prestigious neighborhood of Berry Mills. In early spring of 2010, this quiet community is rocked by a disturbing 911 call.
911, what is the address today? Okay, what's going on?
I'm at my mom and dad's house. I came out to check on the...
Your dad is what?
He's on the floor.
Where's your mom?
My mom is by the computer.
Is your mom breathing?
No.
Okay, and your dad is not breathing?
No.
Okay, all right.
Police race to the scene. First responding officers lead 40-year-old Eric Kola away from his deceased parents' home, while detectives head inside.
We could see that there was a male lying on the kitchen floor. There was a large pool of blood around his head.
The blood was coagulated, so it had been there a while. It wasn't fresh blood.
He was holding his car keys in one hand. He had his coat on, so it was clear that he had just walked in the door. He hadn't even set everything on the counter yet. As I viewed the male victim, the wound appeared to be a gunshot. It was near the temple of his head.
Around the corner is like a hallway entryway with a computer desk, and the female victim was there. She was shot in the head also.
Her hands are on the keyboard, and so you could see that she had been typing before she was shot. What she was typing didn't appear to be significant, but it made us believe that she had no idea that someone was behind her going to shoot her. It appeared that they ambushed them.
The victims are identified as 68-year-old Dennis Kola and his wife, 65-year-old Myrna. As investigators examine the scene, they make note of other telling details.
We didn't know if it was a single killer or more than one person, but you would expect more disturbance if there were more than one, or that they would have overpowered the victims, and that didn't seem to have happened.
With Myrna sitting at the computer comfortably, it led us to wonder if she was the first to be killed. And her husband, Dennis, came home, and he was the second one shot. There was the smell of decomposition. At that point, we weren't sure how many days earlier they were killed, but we needed to get information pretty quickly.
Detectives find no sign of forced entry and no indication of any kind of struggle.
The crime lab comes in. They collect fingerprints and DNA and the computer for analysis. We went upstairs and we noticed in the one bedroom there was a dresser that was disturbed, and it appeared that it had been ransacked. What was unusual about it was the person started at the top and worked their way down with the chest of drawers. But if you did it that way, you wouldn't be able to see what was in the drawer below it.
This looked like someone was trying to make it look like a burglary, but nothing seemed to be missing.
And there were many other valuables in the house, including Myrna's purse, and Dennis' wallet was still in his back pocket. It looked like this was staged, quite frankly.
While investigators continue searching for clues, they find what could be a key piece of evidence.
The bedroom had a .22 rifle in the closet. There's also a box of .22 shells on a shelf that had been moved and partially opened.
That was very possibly the gun that was used in the homicides.
So the gun is sent to the crime lab for an analysis.
As the crime scene investigation continues, news of the murders spreads quickly through the close-knit community.
When I heard about it, I thought, I can't believe this is happening. I was devastated. It hit me real hard. It was like, why would somebody kill them? And everybody loved them.
Born and raised in Wisconsin, Dennis and Myrna Kola had been happily married for 42 years.
Dennis and Myrna had a lot of friends. They had deep roots here.
They had children and grandchildren, and they were very popular.
I didn't hear of anyone that had anything bad to say about either one of them.
From humble beginnings, Dennis rose to become a successful businessman.
Dennis had graduated as a pharmacist, and he had owned a number of pharmacies and businesses throughout the years in different locations.
I worked with him for 2 years. As a boss, he was down to earth, fantastic guy. If you needed something, he was there. He treated me like a daughter.
Dennis was successful in life and in love.
Him and his wife, they were always happy, having a good time. Myrna had a lot of energy. She was very sociable.
Myrna was very well educated, and she was presently teaching part-time on a substitute basis.
They had a good marriage. They enjoyed life.
The couple had 2 children, their son Eric and 37-year-old daughter Cindy. Both were married with families of their own.
Their family seemed pretty tight. Dennis and Myrna, they were involved with their kids and involved with their grandkids.
These were parents who were very dedicated. They really wanted the best for their kids and loved spending time with family. Dennis and Myrna were getting ready to have a quiet retirement and relaxing and enjoying life.
Now, those dreams have been brutally snatched away.
Both shot. I would have never in my life expected something like this to happen.
It just seemed to make no sense. We're trying to understand who would do that and what would be the motive.
While police bring the Kola's son Eric into the station to get more information, investigators go door to door looking for witnesses.
We start canvassing to see if anyone saw anything, heard anything.
Nobody in the neighborhood had seen anything suspicious.
For them, it was just mostly shock. They couldn't believe that these 2 people had been killed.
As detectives continue to search for a lead, they get their first break.
One of the neighbors mentioned that he thought he knew the motive and why it happened, and also the murder.
He was very concerned. He believed that his life was in danger. He felt that he may be next.
This neighbor, Steve Burgess, was a banker, and he thought that he may have been the intended target of the homicide. His reasoning was he had got a threatening call multiple times from a person that threatened to kill him.
Coming up, new evidence emerges.
The day after the homicides, he cashed his $50,000 check and never told us.
And family secrets come to light.
There was some jealousy, maybe bad blood between the 2.
Dennis always complained that he was worthless and that he didn't want to work.
She had apparently lit into Dennis in a rage.
Until a disturbing clue reveals a twisted plan.
Someone had put this threatening note in his mailbox.
Now he believes that someone was out to get him.
And exposes a cold-blooded betrayal nobody saw coming.
I never thought they were the kind of person that would do something like that.
It was extremely unexpected.
It's just chilling.
Grandparents Myrna and Dennis Cola have been brutally executed in their own home. Now, one of their neighbors, banker Steve Burgess, tells investigators the killer could be coming after him.
He was very concerned, and he believed that someone was out to get him, and he didn't know who, but the homicides may have been intended for him and his family.
Detectives ask Steve why someone would want him dead.
So at that time, the market crashed. There was people with money issues.
A lot of people came to him at the bank for loans, but they had no collateral. So people were very angry that Steve would not give them loans. The last threat was a couple of days earlier. It was a threat of violence. It certainly had to be taken serious.
If Steve was the intended target, how did Dennis and Myrna end up gunned down instead?
What he explained was a Google Earth search in front of Burgess's house showed the wrong address, showed Dennis and Myrna's address instead of his, and he thought that the killer killed the wrong people.
He felt that somebody had come to his house to follow through on the threat, but they ended up at Dennis and Myrna's residence. It was a concern that this possibly could have been a mistake on behalf of the murderer, and the homicides were not intended for Dennis and Myrna.
Before investigators can pursue the lead, the autopsy results arrive.
The autopsy report determined that they were both shot with a .22 caliber rifle.
But it was inconclusive. There wasn't enough bullet fragment left to tell if it came from the gun that we found in the house. No fingerprints were found. I mean, even from the victims, like the gun had been cleaned up.
The autopsy report also confirmed that they had been deceased for a few days before the 911 call. It was likely that they were killed on that Friday.
The time of death sheds new light on the threatening phone call made to neighbor Steve Burgess.
We saw that call had come in Sunday morning after the Coolas were murdered. So the timeline it didn't make any sense.
We were able to determine that the threats against Steve Burgess had nothing to do with the deaths of Dennis and Myrna.
With their first lead a bust, detectives turn their attention closer to home.
We knew Eric and his sister Cindy were very close to their parents.
Eric did day trading and stuff like that, work on stocks. He was doing well. Dennis and Eric were pretty close. Some people would say like bread and butter. They'd have get-togethers all the time.
Eric was the one that found the bodies. We needed a conversation with Eric for information that he might be able to provide us.
Hoping he can provide details about the crime, investigators interview Eric at the station.
Eric was still extremely emotional over the death of his parents, but he said he wanted to be as helpful as he possibly could and would do whatever he could to try to find who was responsible.
Detectives ask how he came to find his parents had been killed.
He said the school called and said that Myrna hadn't shown up for work. They called his parents and they didn't respond.
So Eric tried calling and was unable to get an answer, so he called his sister and asked if she had any contact with them, and she had not.
He became concerned and drove over to the house.
Once he walked in the house, he observed his father lying on the kitchen floor and started searching for his mom, and then also found her deceased.
Eric said he was extremely close to his parents. His dad, supported all of his endeavors. They were just the best of buddies.
We asked Eric what was the last time he had seen his parents, and he said a few days before the homicides.
He visited them like he did all the time. He said his dad was working on the deck, and his mom was doing laundry. There didn't seem to be anything unusual.
Investigators ask Eric where he was on the day of the murders.
He said that Friday was he and his wife's anniversary. He had worked till 2. Then he helped his buddy Mike do some work in a bathroom. They were renovating a bathroom. Eric had told us that he had gone to 2 stores after leaving his buddy's house, looking for a specific plant that his wife liked, a hanging plant.
Eric presents a receipt stamped at 6:15 p.m.
After he bought the plant, he went directly home, and they got ready to go out for the evening with friends to celebrate the anniversary. Eric said that he had tried over the weekend to contact his parents and wasn't able to do so. He was becoming concerned, but just thought that they were busy.
When asked who might have wanted to harm his parents, Eric says they were well-liked and had no enemies.
It seemed really strange, really unusual. No reason for the victims to be killed. Both victims killed.
Before concluding Eric's interview, detectives get results back from the crime lab.
The report came back indicating that the time of death, based on the computer analysis, was 5:41 on that Friday.
Myrna was using the computer, and the last keystroke was 5:41 p.m. So that gave us a timestamp. That's huge.
With the keystroke data, detectives verify Eric's alibi.
We spoke to his friend Mike, and Mike said yes, Eric was here until about 5:30 when he left, and he was going to go to the store. So he basically confirmed what Eric was telling us was correct. The receipt, combined with what his friend Mike said, it appeared that there wasn't enough time for Eric to commit the crime. Also, it just seemed very unlikely that someone who loved his mother and father very much could be involved in something like this.
Before Eric leaves the police station, he remembers crucial information that takes detectives by surprise.
Eric had told us that his sister Cindy and her husband Pat were being financially supported by Dennis and Myrna, and that their dad, Dennis, told Cindy they were getting cut off financially.
The Friday morning of the homicides, Cindy had called Dennis. Dennis let her know that there was not going to be any more money. She became very upset.
Had there been an argument over money leading Cindy to kill?
That's extremely unexpected, but she did have motive, so you start looking at Cindy as a suspect.
Police investigating the double homicide of Dennis and Myrna Cola believe their daughter Cindy may have been angry with her father after he cut off financial support. The two had a tense conversation just hours before the murders.
When we started talking to the circle of friends and family, we were told Dennis was more than generous. He gave tens of thousands to Cindy and her husband.
Cindy relied on her parents. They needed this money to pay their bills. When Dennis had told Cindy that he was cutting her off, she didn't know how those bills were going to get paid.
Detectives learn the Cola's children are set to inherit over $700,000 from their parents' death. While son Eric is known in the community as a successful businessman, Cindy's circumstances are different.
Cindy didn't have much money, if any, and she was constantly asking for money because they were not making ends meet.
She was working a minimum wage job or a little above that, and Pat, her husband, couldn't keep a job, would quit or get fired. They were living paycheck to paycheck and Dennis's handout to handout.
Me and Dennis would talk about Cindy at the pharmacy, and he kept telling me that he was sick and tired of supporting her every month, helping them out with their bills and stuff like that. And that Friday morning, he was very upset, and he said, "My daughter called me this morning, crying on the phone because I told my daughter that I'm cutting her and her husband off."
When she would get upset, she would get just extreme, over-the-top emotions. Cindy hearing that the cash cow was being butchered would be a reason for her to now go off the rails, and it went from bad to worse.
Cindy became a strong suspect.
Police bring Cindy into the station for questioning.
Cindy appeared broke up over the deaths of her parents, but she really laid out the family dynamic. Her parents had considered her the black sheep of the family. She said that she didn't believe her parents cared about her like they cared about Eric. and she was upset with how they treated her.
She told us, according to her parents, that Eric could do no wrong and that Cindy was a disappointment and continued to be a disappointment.
But Cindy denied that she had anything to do with her parents' death, even though there was this friction between them.
Investigators questioned Cindy about the argument with her father the morning of the murders.
Cindy downplayed the conversation she had with her father. She said just that she was disappointed her father had said he wouldn't give her any money. But it wasn't a negative conversation.
Detectives wonder if Cindy is more guilty than she's letting on.
There was a lot of tension between Cindy and her parents. There was disapproval there.
We looked at desperation. She was desperate for money with the inheritance, and given her bad feelings, all these things could lead to the fact that she may have been the one that took the lives of her parents.
With suspicions swirling, police asked Cindy where she was when her parents were killed.
On Friday, she was working and had left at 4:45. They have a time clock. She had punched out.
After work, she had stopped at the store just after 5:30. She'd purchased beer and ice, and then her and Patrick at a barbecue with the neighbors.
Police worked to confirm Cindy's alibi.
She was working. That was verified then. Cindy had stopped at a Quick Trip, and the Quick Trips all have video, so she was on camera at a Quick Trip near her home at the time of the homicides, not anywhere near her parents.
While Cindy is ruled out as the shooter, her husband Patrick comes into focus.
Family and friends said that Patrick did not get along with Dennis and Myrna, and Patrick stood to inherit a substantial amount of money along with Cindy.
Dennis did not like her husband at all. He told me that Cindy's husband married Cindy for the money because he knew that Dennis and Myrna had money. Dennis always complained that his son-in-law, Patrick, was worthless and that he didn't want to work. He sits and plays with the video games, and he's too lazy to go find a job.
Investigators dig deeper into Patrick's relationship with his in-laws.
Talking to family and friends, we learned that Dennis and Myrna were upset when Patrick and Cindy got married. They asked Cindy not to marry him. They felt that he lacked motivation, and they remained unhappy with him. And I think the feeling was mutual.
According to some reports, when there was alcohol involved, he could have been a violent person.
Apparently, the Friday morning of the homicides, Cindy told Patrick that they were not going to be getting any more money. People were saying that Patrick was even more angry than Cindy, that they were being cut off financially. It was a large red flag.
Detectives also learned Patrick had the capability to pull off an execution-style hit.
Eric and other relatives were now pointing us toward Patrick, saying that he was a Marine and that he knew how to handle weapons.
It certainly moves Patrick up to the top of the list as far as suspects.
Police hunting the killer of Dennis and Myrna Cola believe their son-in-law, Patrick Cowell, has motive for murder.
Patrick was a great interest to us because he did not get along with Dennis and Myrna, and he stood to inherit a lot of money, so it certainly is motive. And Patrick was in the Marine Corps, so he would be an expert marksman.
When I heard that the police are starting to question him, I thought maybe after Dennis mentioned cutting them off, that might have triggered his son-in-law to kill them both.
At the police station, detectives confront Patrick about his relationship with his in-laws.
Patrick said that he was not popular in that family, that he was not comfortable with them. They weren't comfortable with him. There was kind of a cold relationship. He knew from Cindy that they were being cut off from Dennis and Myrna. He wasn't happy about it, but he denied having any involvement in the homicides.
Investigators pressed Patrick about where he was at the time of the murders.
He was without a job at the time, and basically he spent most of his day on the sofa with Xbox. We asked if he had any guns in the house, and he agreed that he did. We asked if he would turn those over to us, and he said he would.
As detectives wrap up their interview with Patrick, patrol officers are dispatched to collect the gun and gaming console, which are then sent on to the crime lab.
The gun had been analyzed and, in fact, was eliminated as the weapon used to kill Dennis and Myrna.
Also, we were able to prove through the crime lab that he was on the Xbox at the time he said he was. And so that eliminated him because he was home at the time that Dennis and Myrna were killed.
With Patrick ruled out, police are left scrambling for new suspects. The unsolved homicides leave the community on edge.
When a crime like this happens in a small town like Berry Mills, there's a lot of pressure on law enforcement to get it solved. People want answers. These aren't strangers to them. These are people they know.
People in that neighborhood were fearful. You know, the closer you are to something like that, the more concerned you are.
We were kind of scared for our lives because we didn't know why something like this would happen.
Looking for new leads, investigators dig into Dennis's business connections and the wealthy pharmacist's other ventures around town.
Dennis had a nephew, Nick Herring, who was promised a business from Dennis. They were going to open a car dealership together and actually did.
What we understood was that Nick was very familiar with running car dealerships and had done a good job.
Business was good, but then Dennis changed the deal.
As the dealership was up and running, Dennis brought Eric, his son, in to start running it with Nick, and there was some jealousy, maybe bad blood between the two.
Nick was like complaining all the time, so Dennis had to go help out with the business. Dennis said they could not get along together, and he ended up buying Nick out.
At that point, Nick was quite unhappy, and there was some falling out.
Tension mounted until Dennis sold the business, leaving Nick resentful.
Nick lost a pretty substantial amount of money, so he would certainly have reason to be upset.
Could Nick have harbored a deadly desire for revenge? Police bring him into the station for questioning.
We spoke to Nick Herring, and he admitted that the relationship had soured.
Nick had said that Dennis had given him too low amount for the business and that he got cheated out of some profit. Nick felt that he had been treated badly, basically kicked to the curb by his uncle.
Despite the bad blood, Nick insists he's not involved in the murders.
Nick said that it was in the past that he had started his own car dealership. He was successful, and that although it was upsetting, he wouldn't hold a grudge, and he had no reason to kill Dennis and Myrna.
Nick said that he had worked until about 5:30. Then he had picked up his girlfriend, and they'd gone out to the tavern. We were able to confirm that he was at work all day, and then the bartender where they were at could confirm that he and his girlfriend had spent the evening. And so we were able to eliminate him.
Having ruled out yet another suspect, the investigation into the Cola murders hits a roadblock.
It was very disturbing because it just seemed to make no sense. Here's a couple that are a retirement age, had long, successful careers. For someone to come in and just murder them, it's senseless. We were still trying to understand who would do that and what would be the motive.
1 week after the murders, police receive news that jolts the investigation back to life.
We get a call that a patrol car is being sent out to Eric Kula's residence for a suspicious item in the mailbox. Eric said that he had got a threatening letter. He was now extremely concerned that he was going to get killed.
One week after Dennis and Myrna Cola are ruthlessly gunned down in their own home, police learn their 40-year-old son Eric has received a threatening note. Could he be the next target?
Someone had put this note in his mailbox. He was really, really concerned. This note said, "Fixed you." The message is kind of unusual, but Eric thought they'd killed his parents and were now going to come after him.
He had no idea who would have left it or where it came from.
There was an envelope, but it wasn't mailed.
The handwriting looked like it was done by someone very young. It was so strange. It was probably written that way so a handwriting analysis couldn't be done.
When it comes to Eric's safety, detectives don't take any chances.
We have to try to figure out what was going on.
We had an investigator and a camera to watch his property. We start canvassing Eric's neighborhood to see if anyone saw anything.
But with no witnesses, police are still left with no idea who placed the note.
This is perplexing. We're trying to determine, was this somebody local or was this someone from out of the area? We were very concerned.
With this new potential threat, investigators cast a wider net to find the Colas killer. But when they scour Dennis and Myrna's computers, phones, and finances, they're surprised at what they find.
We subpoenaed Dennis and Myrna's bank records and noticed that there's a check written and cashed on Dennis and Myrna's account for $50,000. It's cashed on the day after the murder, and it's made out to Eric Kula and was deposited into Eric's bank account. It seemed really strange. So you just found your parents dead, and the next day you go cash a check for $50K. It had to be looked at.
Detectives reach out to Eric, hoping to learn more details.
Eric's explanation is his dad gave it to him on the day that he had stopped over at his parents' house.
That's very interesting because of all the conversations we had with Eric, he never mentioned this, and suddenly we have a check for $50,000, and if everything was okay, why wouldn't he tell us about it?
To have a check that was deposited the day after the murders by a family member, that set off alarms for investigators.
After we find that check, we look for other checks.
We used a forensic accountant to review Eric's finances because it was quite complicated with the day trading that he was involved in. When the accountant went through it with us and explained what we were looking at, I think we almost fell off our chairs because we had no idea that this was what was going on. He told everybody that he was extremely successful with his day trading, but Eric was broke.
He was day trading, but it was a myth as far as making profit. The person looking at his financials basically called BS. She told us this guy's worth nothing. He's worth about $2,000 total. He was blowing smoke.
Then, police uncover more startling information about Eric's financial circumstances.
We learned that Eric was also going to his parents and receiving large amounts of money. Through the years, it was hundreds of thousands of dollars. He led everybody to believe that he was doing so well, including his wife. Eric told her that he was making a lot of money. There was nothing to worry about, that he was just doing great.
Despite everyone's impression that Eric was this successful day trader, his parents had been funding his and his family's lifestyle.
If he was going to have to admit that to family, friends, it was going to be devastating.
Detectives learn when Dennis and Myrna stopped financially supporting their daughter, Cindy, they also cut off Eric.
We knew just shortly before Dennis and Myrna were killed, Eric found out that he was no longer getting money from his parents.
The damning evidence continues to pile up against Eric.
Dennis told me he was giving money to Eric, but basically he was done giving to those kids. He says, I need to tell them I'm done supporting them. It's about time I put my foot down and cut them off.
As investigators start to discover that Eric is not what he seems, shocking results come back from the lab.
The state crime lab did a handwriting analysis on that check for $50,000. It wasn't Dennis's signature on that check. We found out that it was Eric's handwriting, that he had forged his father's name on that check.
Everything he's told us is a lie. So things are starting to really roll toward Eric.
Police obtain a warrant to search Eric's home, hoping to find additional incriminating evidence.
We're in the basement. Among other things, was a box of envelopes in a desk drawer. The fixed U note had a security envelope, and every one of them has a different pattern for their security pattern. Lo and behold, those envelopes have the same pattern. We were able to determine that envelope in Eric's mailbox with the fixed U note came from the box of envelopes in his home. From his fire pit in his backyard, we found things that would be associated with making a fixed U note. A spring from a spiral notebook. The letter was written on spiral notebook paper. A barrel of a pen used to write the address. Those types of things are in the fire. So that fixed U note came from his house. It didn't look good for Eric.
In the search, detectives also discover a .22 caliber rifle, similar to what police believe was the murder weapon. The gun is sent to the ballistics lab for testing.
With the lies and forgery, we were pretty confident that Eric was our guy.
But at that point, Eric had an alibi for the entire time that the homicides were occurring. So we're trying to figure out how he shot Dennis and Myrna.
Detectives investigating the double homicide of Dennis and Myrna Kola suspect the couple's own son, 40-year-old Eric, is the killer. But they need hard evidence to lay charges.
We went out and started re-interviewing witnesses and reviewing all the evidence that we had.
As detectives try to learn more details about Eric's connection to the crime, the ballistics results come back. Police wonder if the rifle found in Eric's home will prove to be the murder weapon.
Dennis and Myrna were shot with a .22 caliber rifle, but Eric's gun wasn't the gun that was involved in the crime.
Undeterred, detectives recheck Eric's alibi for when his parents were being murdered.
The time of death, based on the computer analysis, was 5:41 on that Friday.
Prior to the homicide, Eric said that he'd helped his buddy Mike renovating a bathroom.
When we originally talked to Mike, he said that Eric had left his house about 5:30, but when we re-interviewed him, he said it's very possible it could have been earlier. Once Mike's story changed, we really thought that we were heading in the right direction.
Investigators take a closer look at Eric's timeline.
Eric had told us that he had gone to 2 stores after leaving his buddy's house to get a specific plant for his wife. At the time of the homicide, he had stopped at the first store, and that store didn't have it, so he had to go to the other store, got the plant, and produced a receipt.
Eric's receipt is stamped 6:15 p.m. The second store is located only 10 minutes from the Kola's residence. But where was Eric at 5:41 when his parents were being shot?
We checked with the garden center, the first one he went to, and they had plenty of those plants on the day and time that Eric said that they didn't have any. We also reviewed video footage, and he's not there, nor is his vehicle seen coming or leaving the parking lot. So there was a window of opportunity for Eric to commit the murders. He had no alibi for the time that the computer showed that Myrna was shot.
With Eric's alibi torn apart, detectives bring him in for another interview. They begin by confronting Eric about forging the $50,000 check.
Eric explained that he had permission from his dad to write checks out to himself, and that his dad had actually given him the check, but just was too busy, so told him to sign it himself. He told us, "I write them all the time," and that was commonplace for him to do that. It's a lie, and a provable one. He's never written one. He couldn't produce a single check that he had ever written. He was confronted with the fixed U note and about the envelopes and that they did come from his house. With what we found and what we knew about his financials, all of those things together are great evidence.
We just went down item after item after item after item, and Eric acted, in my opinion, desperate, and he wanted to leave.
But Eric was no longer free to go. On July 29, 2010, police charge Eric with the murder of his parents, Dennis and Myrna Cola.
What we believe started this whole crime in motion was the fact that Eric was being cut off financially. He was desperate.
Detectives pieced together how the double homicide unfolded.
We believe he went to see his mom at their home, and Myrna was sitting at the computer, and then Eric walked upstairs, got the gun that was located in the closet, came down and shot his mother, and then waited for his father to arrive. When Dennis came home, he was shot almost immediately, within seconds after he walked through that door.
After the murders, Eric wipes the gun clean and returns it to the closet.
Eric then took a check and said to himself, $50,000 will get me through until the will is settled.
After he shot his parents, he went to a garden center, bought the plant for his alibi, and went home to celebrate their anniversary dinner that night.
He's as cold-blooded as a murder-for-hire man. His parents did nothing but love him and take care of him his whole life. He's a narcissistic little son of a bitch and thought that his dad owed him a living.
Eric Cola's arrest stuns the community.
Everyone thought that he was this golden child, that he had a great relationship with his parents, that he was this successful day trader. That he could have done this, people were shocked.
I would have never expected Eric to do this. The way Dennis talked about him, always bragged about his son, and I never thought he was the kind of person that would do something like that.
In June 2012, 2 years after Dennis and Myrna Cola were killed, a jury finds their son Eric guilty of intentional murder.
His sister, Cindy, during the sentencing hearing, was sobbing, and she begged the judge in that courtroom to make sure justice was done that day.
Eric Cola is sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, plus 6 years for forgery.
Many times I've thought about how somebody could do that, and I just simply can't fathom it. I guess we all lose a bit of our innocence when this kind of thing happens.
Myrna and Dennis are still dearly missed by their family and friends.
They were such a beautiful couple. They would give you your shirt off their back. I think of them very, very often. And my memory of Dennis is always a smiley face. I do miss him a lot. Sometimes I still think, boy, why did it have to be you? He'd still be living right now, happy life, finally retired, and enjoying his grandkids. And Myrna would probably still be dragging him on vacation.
A vibrant and loving young mother.
She was just an awesome person. She had a little feisty side to her because of the redhead, but she was always looking out for everybody else.
Is found savagely murdered inside an office building washroom.
There was insulated electrical wire used to strangle her.
It appeared there had been a sexual assault.
Detectives pursue multiple suspects.
There were problems with the marriage. They had had issues. They had been arguing.
He was in the building the night she was killed. His prints matched the prints inside the bathroom stall.
And hunt down an elusive killer.
We talked to the attorney, who states that he is probably somewhere in South America.
I said, okay, where's he at? Can we get him?
That no one could have imagined.
I was in shock. I couldn't believe it.
It was very unexpected to see him as the actual killer.
Known for its live music scene, Austin, Texas is also one of the safest big cities in the country.
Austin's kind of one of those cool vibe cities, and it's just a very good mix of people.
There's a lot of green belts and parks and creeks and trails. It's a really neat place to live. Austin has not had the kind of crime and the volume of crime as other large cities. People do typically feel safe.
But in 1983, the town is rocked when a local businessman makes a gruesome discovery.
In the early morning hours of September 20th, 1983, the Austin Police Department received a 911 call. One of the tenants of an office complex had come in the morning and discovered things were out of place. There was a cleaning cart out in the hallway, so he went to try to find out if anyone else was still in the building. He did discover a deceased female in the upstairs men's restroom.
The 911 caller did not know her name, but he recognized her as the woman who did clean the building.
Police are dispatched to the scene.
When we located the female victim in the men's restroom, she was positioned inside of the stall.
She was undressed. There was insulated electrical wire that had small loops tied on the ends of them. Detectives believed that electrical wire was used to strangle her and be the cause of her death. It appeared, because she had no defensive wounds at all, that the killer came up from behind and surprised her.
Everything in the crime scene suggested that this was a violent attack.
There was wet toilet paper inside of her nose and her mouth. It stands to reason the killer put that in her mouth and her nose after he strangled her to ensure that she was good and dead.
There was a bodily fluid and a clothing that made it appear as if she was drug across the floor. Her clothes were scattered amongst the restroom, and it appeared that there had been a sexual assault. The victim was identified by an ID that was found inside of her purse. She was Lori Stout, a 22-year-old female from Austin.
While forensics collect samples, investigators look for other evidence left behind by the killer.
A significant fingerprint was located in the men's stall of the restroom.
When dragging her in there, a person would almost have to brace themselves on the wall of the inside of the stall. The print inside the bathroom stall matched a print on the second floor fire escape. So the two of those were pretty significant.
Had the killer fled through the fire escape after committing the murder? Detectives head down to the parking lot looking for more clues.
They found that there was a spool that was used for insulated electrical wiring inside the dumpster. They also found some looser pieces of the same type of wiring that was used to kill the victim.
Detectives bag the items for analysis. Back inside, police start piecing together a theory of who could have committed this horrible act.
The fact that the victim was killed inside the building in the middle of the night suggested that whoever did this had access or a key to get in it.
Detectives canvass the building and talk to employees, but determined that no one had seen anything suspicious.
We were able to talk with two witnesses that saw Lori at about 12:30 a.m. as they locked up and secured the building and left.
We know that she was last seen alive around 12:30 in the morning, and the employee at the building discovered her body around 8 a.m. So she died sometime during that time frame.
Just as investigators are finishing up, a frantic man arrives at the scene. He identifies himself as Gary Stout and demands to know where his wife Lori is.
Gary Stout told detectives he woke up that morning and discovered that his wife was not home yet from work. He got worried and he drove up to the building, which was a short distance away, and discovered her car still in the parking lot, but it was surrounded by numerous police cars. It was at that point that the police spoke with him and broke the news that his wife was found dead.
He was obviously traumatized by what had happened.
As police take Gary down to the station for questioning, The devastating news soon spreads to the rest of Lori's family.
I was in shock. I couldn't believe it. My whole world changed. I no longer had my confidant, no longer had my best friend. It was horrible, horrible.
When we found out that Lori had been killed, it was a big impact. It was overwhelming.
Born in Arlington, Virginia in 1960, Lori Coffey was a naturally warm and caring soul.
Laurie was the oldest of Laurie, myself, and TJ, but she was kind of the mother hen of us all. She had a little feisty side to her, and I think maybe because of the redhead, but she was always looking out for everybody else. She was just an awesome person. She really, truly was.
Lori was the leader of us three musketeers, me, Beverly, and Lori. And she kept us going.
After moving to Austin with her mother and siblings, in 1977, Lori met Gary Stout, who worked logistics for the military.
It all flourished very fast. She was so giddy about Gary, and they fell in love. All in all, he just seemed like a good guy, so we were all, okay, so this is it.
After a whirlwind courtship, Lori and Gary married the following year. 3 years later, Lori became pregnant.
She was over the moon, very, very happy. I mean, that's what she wanted. She wanted to be married, start having a family, and she was on her way.
But Lori is soon forced to face the harsh realities of military family life.
Gary got orders to go to Belgium. She was very sad. Lori was sad that Gary was gone overseas, and here she was facing having a baby on her own at home.
On January 26, 1982, while Gary is away, Lori gives birth to a baby girl.
Lori had a really easy labor, and, now we have this little baby, and, of course, she was ecstatic.
I think that she very much enjoyed being a mother. I think that she experienced probably the happiest months of her life after I was born.
In order to spend more time with his family, Gary left the military and took a job as a maintenance worker in the same building where Lori worked nights as a cleaner.
She was very excited that he was coming home. That's all she wanted, just to be a mom and wife, homemaker.
With her life finally on track, how did this loving young mother become the victim of a cold-blooded killer?
As with any investigation, you have to look at those that are closest to the victim and those that have motive. As an employee of the building, a maintenance worker there, Gary had access.
Down at the station, police questioned Gary about his marriage to Lori.
When we asked him about any problems in their relationship, he quickly admitted that they had had issues, they had been arguing, and were unhappy.
Detectives discovered that Lori actually went and stayed with her sister, Beverly, shortly before the murder happened because of a really big argument that she had with Gary.
Things were not going all that well for her and Gary, and she was miserable.
This definitely created a concern that there were problems with the marriage. So knowing that he has access and motive, it raises the level of suspicion that he could have been involved in this crime.
Coming up, detectives uncover disturbing secrets.
He wasn't happy in his relationship, and he admitted that he was looking at leaving her.
Lori's family felt very strongly that he was the killer.
Before a shocking tip takes police in a whole new direction.
We received information from a female victim of a man that committed a similar attack against her.
This is a big turning point in the investigation.
Could this be a serial rapist? Could it be a serial murder?
And has detectives risking it all to catch a killer.
He knew it was going to have to be something big for us to find him.
We were holding our breath. We weren't sure it was going to happen.
Police investigating the murder of 22-year-old mother Lori Stout are questioning their first suspect, her husband Gary.
When Gary was being interviewed, he was very forthcoming about the poor state of his marriage with Lori. So it was a little bit of a red flag.
this point in the investigation, we need additional information about problems that may be in their relationship.
Laurie and Gary were happy. When they first got married, she was proud to be a wife. That's all she wanted.
But things changed when Gary returned from overseas.
Laurie wanted it to just be like it was before he left, and unfortunately that was not the case.
So knowing the family's account of their relationship as well, knowing that it was a volatile relationship, that created concern that he could have been frustrated with Laurie and committed this type of act.
When detectives press Gary for details about why his marriage was falling apart, he makes an alarming confession.
He admitted that he had actually had an affair and was looking at leaving Laurie.
Gary tells detectives that he met a woman while overseas and that she had since come to visit him in Austin.
At this point, the detectives are wondering, does Gary want Laurie out of the picture given the very bad state of their marriage and the fact that he wants to be with this woman he's having an affair with?
Gary explains that he ultimately chose to stay with Laurie, but detectives become even more suspicious after they ask him for an alibi.
He stated that the night before, he and Laurie had an argument, so she went and slept on the couch. At one point, she finally just got up in the early morning hours, went to work. Gary did not have an alibi that we could confirm. He was at home with the young child, asleep. He could have left his house, gone up to the building, and come back. That would not be something we could verify.
So the marital difficulties, and now we've got a big fight, and Gary having access to the building. He's somebody that they're looking at pretty hard.
Detectives ask Gary to provide samples of his blood and fingerprints to be compared with evidence found at the crime scene.
He was cooperative with us. He provided samples that were requested.
Looking further into Gary's movements leading up to the murder, investigators reach out to his boss at the office building.
The manager of the building informed the detectives that Gary had fixed a water heater the day before Laurie was killed. And he used the same type of electrical wiring that was used to kill Laurie.
This was another extremely big flag in the case. All these things together really raised the suspicion that this is the guy.
As police wait for forensic testing results, Laurie's autopsy report comes in.
Laurie's cause of death was in fact strangulation, and that seemed to match the ligature found at the scene.
What was determined is that a sexual assault had taken place.
They were able to get a sample of semen. However, this is 1983, so there was no DNA testing available. In order to do any comparison, we used blood type antigens. This kind of evidence is helpful in narrowing down the field of suspects.
When we found out how Laurie was actually killed, it was disturbing. First thought to my mind, one sick individual. One very sick individual that did it.
Pure evil. Absolute pure evil.
Detectives eagerly receive the results of Gary's fingerprints and blood tests, but they are far from conclusive.
Gary's fingerprints did not match the one inside the stall, but did match prints in the building. But he has access to the building and he is working there. His blood type, it matches the type found in the semen. But of course, Gary is married to Laurie, so it's another piece of evidence that can go both ways.
Ultimately, we couldn't use fingerprints or any blood work to exclude him.
Running out of options, detectives try one last method to get to the truth.
Gary Stout was provided an opportunity to take a polygraph. During that interview, he was asked if he was responsible for the murder of Laurie, and he advised he wasn't. The results of that polygraph indicated that he was being truthful and there was no deception.
Detectives were surprised that Gary passed the polygraph. Now, detectives have motive, they have access, but no evidence conclusively to show that Gary is in fact the killer.
With nothing to hold him on, Gary is free to go.
At this point, Gary is not ruled out as a suspect, but he takes a little bit more of a backseat.
Looking for new leads, investigators turn their focus back to the numerous employees who work at the building where Laurie was killed.
What's difficult, particularly about a public space like this, is so many people have access. We talked to everybody that was a tenant in that building and started working our way through that process. Many of those folks were excluded based on fingerprints, evidence, everything else that could really put them to the side.
But police learned that the building's tenants weren't the only ones who had access that night.
We discovered that registration was being conducted from the University of Texas' satellite location at this office complex. And they stayed late after hours so that folks could come after work, sign up late into the evening. So this was definitely something of interest for us.
Detectives were able to get the names of the male students who had gone in that night, and they had them come down to the police department, and they got fingerprints of these individuals.
Police processed the fingerprints of over a dozen students and receive an alarming result.
We were able to rule everyone out on the list with the exception of one. We had a fingerprint inside the men's restroom as well as a fire escape door. So this person is somebody we want to talk to and interview.
Detectives investigating the brutal murder of Lori Stout have just matched a set of crime scene fingerprints with someone who was in the building that night.
The University of Texas was having a sign-up registration at the satellite campus, which allowed people to come after hours in the evenings after work in order to get signed up for classes. So we start going through the list of registrants.
Detectives were able to determine that there was one student whose prints matched the prints inside the bathroom stall where Lori was found, and also on the fire escape door on that second floor.
That individual was identified as Robert 𝗞𝗶𝗹𝗶, and he was 18 years old.
Investigators interview Robert about his movements on the night Lori was killed.
He told us that he had been there for registration, and on his way out, he used the men's restroom upstairs. Once he was done in the restroom, he exited the fire escape because it was closer to where his vehicle was parked, which would explain why his fingerprints were found in the men's stall and the fire escape door.
Robert 𝗞𝗶𝗹𝗏 did acknowledge that he saw the cleaning lady, which was our victim, Lori, after using the bathroom on the second floor before he exited the building.
Robert tells detectives that he left the building at around 12:15 a.m. Before investigators look to verify his story, they ask Robert for a blood sample to compare to the semen found at the crime scene.
Robert 𝗞𝗶𝗏𝗏 was cooperative. He gave the blood sample at the time, and the detectives submitted it for testing.
There is nothing that we discover on Robert 𝗞𝗶𝗏𝗏's criminal history or anything else that causes concern. It appears he's had no contact with law enforcement and no violent offenses in the past.
He came from a family that is very well respected. His parents are pretty well-known surgeons in the Austin area. There didn't seem to be anything that would suggest him to behave in this kind of violent way.
While they wait for the results, detectives look for anyone who can corroborate Robert's story.
Detectives interviewed 2 employees of the education office, and they confirmed that they saw Robert 𝗞𝗶𝗏𝗏 leave the building at 12:15. We know Lori was still alive because there were witnesses that confirmed she was alive at 12:30.
With Robert looking less and less like a viable suspect, his blood test results come in.
The analysis of the blood sample told us that Robert was not a match to the bodily fluids found at the crime scene.
The discovery means there is no hard evidence against Robert, and they are forced to let him go.
Robert 𝗞𝗶𝗏𝗏 was ruled out and eliminated as a suspect.
With no new leads, the investigation falters. As weeks pass with no arrests, fear in the community grows.
The nature of the crime had created a lot of panic for residents, particularly females. It was difficult because there was no resolution.
It left a lot of fear in the community. The police felt pressure to find out who was responsible for Lori's death. I mean, this was a totally innocent mother, 22 years old, taken from her family in a very violent attack.
The people in and around that area where she was killed, they were interested in knowing what was going on. It was tough on our family. It is very frustrating. There's somebody out there that has taken a life, and you want that person to be held accountable.
Anytime there's a crime committed like this, there's an inherent pressure to solve it, to try to bring some closure and some comfort to the family and to the community.
A person that could do something like this, that's not somebody that's going to stop at that one act. Typically speaking, that person is going to continue to hurt other people.
We're always worried that, he can continue to commit these kind of acts until he's brought to justice.
1 month after Lori's murder, police receive a promising new lead.
We received information from a female victim of a man that committed a similar attack against her. The victim was sexually assaulted and strangled, but she was able to get away.
He mistakenly thought she was dead, and she was able to identify him. That person's name was Daryl Kemp. Daryl Kemp at that point was in prison, but he was not in prison at the time that Lori was killed.
And so we started looking into this. We evaluated the information and started to determine if this could potentially be a suspect in this case.
Police dig into Daryl Kemp's background and discover a disturbing pattern.
It's determined that Daryl Kemp committed an attack in 1960, similar, where the victim was sexually assaulted and strangled.
He was convicted for the rape and murder of a woman named Marjorie Hipperson in California. He did receive the death penalty for that. But later on, that death penalty got overturned.
Ultimately, he was released and paroled in 1978. That's when Daryl Kemp moved to Austin.
His MO matched. He's killed in this fashion before, and he was in Austin at the time. So this is going to be somebody that detectives look at pretty intently.
Could this be a serial rapist? Could it be a serial murder? We had questions that we needed to get answers to.
One month after young mother Lori Stout was found raped and murdered in a bathroom stall, police are investigating a tip that she was the victim of convicted serial killer Daryl Kemp.
Detectives at this time were thinking that Daryl Kemp was a strong possibility as a suspect because of the similar MO, which was sexual assault and strangulation.
Investigators learn that although Daryl is currently in jail for an unrelated crime, he was a free man at the time Lori was killed. Detectives head to prison to question him.
The difficult part about interviewing somebody like Daryl Kemp is he's obviously been down this road before. He's got knowledge of how investigations work, and so information may be withheld or may not be genuine in his responses based on where he thinks or feels like your questions are leading him.
Detectives start by questioning Daryl about where he was around the time of Lori's murder.
They're asking him questions that would help tie him or connect him to the area that the building was located in. They asked if he knew where this building was, where he lived, basically to try to put him in a geographical area, figure out where he frequented.
Daryl tells investigators he wasn't near the office building where Lori was killed and has no ties to the area.
Daryl Kemp was asked if he was familiar with Lori Stout. He said he wasn't. Things that we're trying to pay attention to is whether his statements are truthful. Does his body language support his statement? Does it appear he's being deceptive? And is he forthcoming with his answers?
Not trusting the word of a convicted killer, detectives shift gears.
He was asked if he would take a polygraph. He hesitated with that because he didn't trust polygraphs. He is not cooperative at all.
It's the same story when investigators ask him for his fingerprints and a blood sample.
Again, he was very uncooperative.
Based on all the evidence collected, we had enough information to obtain a warrant.
Police collect Daryl's samples and eagerly wait for the results.
When the results of the analysis were returned, it was determined that he was not the suspect in this murder. It's very difficult and frustrating because we're at a stalling point again.
With no other leads, the case once again hits a wall. As the months turn into years, Lori's loved ones struggle with the lack of closure.
Why are we not getting any answers? Give us something. I myself have been lost without her.
Every time October 1st rolls around, First thing I think is, oh, it's Lori's birthday. Anytime when September comes around, when she was taken from us, it's not good.
The suspicion that Lori's husband Gary was the killer continues to linger and causes a deep divide.
My mother's family, even members of his own family, believed that my dad was involved.
We all still had that suspicion that Gary had something to do with it.
Eventually, Gary takes Dale and moves out of state.
Gary, he didn't want to have anything else to do with us. So it was like, oh my God, now we can't see Dale. I lost my sister, but I also lost that connection with my niece.
Being so young, she didn't really remember her mom. So it was probably quite hard on Dale.
When I was growing up, there weren't a whole lot of conversations about my mother. It was just the understanding of she wasn't there anymore.
As Dale grows older, she begins to ask questions.
My dad did not like talking about it. I did not have a family member sit me down and explain to me that this is what had happened to her. It wasn't until I got older, got access to the internet, that's when I learned that she was attacked, that she had been strangled, that she had been raped, and then she had been murdered. It was very overwhelming finding out about it in that way.
Lori's family continues to push for her killer to be brought to justice.
We never gave up hope. We tried to keep it fresh and focused on it. We were constantly checking in.
We had to get this case closed to help give our family a little peace. It was overwhelming.
The pressure finally pays off. And in 1992, nearly 10 years after Lori's murder, a new team of detectives reopen her case.
Now we have new eyes looking at everything. They look at the crime scene photos. They read all the police reports. They look at the various people that were interviewed.
Part of that process is to go back and look at old evidence. Are there things now that are available to law enforcement that weren't previously available? Is there testing that can be done?
Now we're in 1992, so we have DNA testing, which is much more powerful.
With that in mind, investigators revisit their prime suspect, Lori's husband, Gary Stout.
So Gary was contacted again and provided a DNA sample, which was compared to that obtained at the crime scene.
Police are hopeful that they'll finally have the evidence they need to make an arrest. But when the results come back, they are shocked at what they reveal.
It was determined that Gary was not a match. So officially, he could be ruled out as a suspect and remove the cloud of doubt that had been hanging over his head for some period of time.
I do believe that my father felt relief, but it was very difficult for him to talk about.
With Gary cleared, cold case detectives go back over the old files, line by line.
With any review of a case, you look at who's been interviewed, who's been eliminated, and what was discovered is that one of the reports that was provided as far as the blood typing seemed to have an error.
The documentation that was used to finalize the forensic report that excluded a suspect actually showed that there was a clerical error in that lab report. And that particular suspect should have been included as a suspect, not excluded. This is a big turning point in the investigation.
10 years after wife and mother Lori Stout was savagely murdered, cold case detectives have unearthed a stunning error in the results of a blood test. That means a previously cleared suspect might not be innocent after all.
What was discovered is that the report said the subject could be eliminated, but there was a clerical error in the document and it should have read that he could not be eliminated.
This suspect is Robert Van Wiese, the 18-year-old University of Texas student. He was in the building the night Lori was killed, registering for a class, and he's the same person whose prints were found inside the bathroom stall and also on the second floor fire escape door.
Detectives look into what Robert Van Wiese had been doing the last 10 years.
Robert Van Wiese had no criminal history. Here we have this 18-year-old college student coming from a well-to-do family, parents who are professionals, seem to have a very normal, happy upbringing. He was cooperative. So that all combined with the report that we received, naturally excluded him as a suspect.
Could 18-year-old Robert really have committed such a brutal crime?
In talking with witnesses, Robert Van Wiese is seen about 12:15 a.m. and leaving, but about 12:30, they see Lori in the building by herself.
Detectives re-examine the fingerprints he left at the crime scene and notice something troubling.
What they discover is that his story of exiting the building through that second-floor fire escape door would naturally support fingerprints being left on the inside of that door, as if you're pushing it open to leave. But some prints of his are found on the door handle on the exterior of the door, as if you're opening it to enter the building.
What this told us is that he had obviously left the building, but he had also come back in.
He would have been able to re-enter it through that same door if he had propped it open with something.
The discoveries mean investigators need to talk to Robert, but there's a problem.
We try to locate Robert Van Wiese, but we're not able to. We reach out to family members who are not cooperative. They provide an attorney's contact. We talk to the attorney who states that Robert Van Wiese is probably somewhere in South America.
All evidence up to that point showed he was in the Austin area, and then he likely finds out that he, once again, is a suspect, and now we have DNA testing capability, so he flees.
Fearing Robert has left the country, detectives scramble to find him. They interview dozens of his friends and family members, but no one is willing to cooperate. Before they can launch an all-out search, detectives still need more proof that Robert's the killer. So they come up with a plan to obtain his DNA.
With Robert Van Wiese having fled, we cannot get a sample from him, but what we are able to do is get what's called YSTR testing accomplished. And that's familial DNA, and it's specific to the Y chromosome that all brothers and fathers would share. So since Robert Van Wiese has brothers in the Austin area, that's something we can actually test.
In order to obtain the sample, detectives conducted surveillance with family members, and at one point they observed one of the brothers discard trash and retrieve it.
Trash is not something you need to get a search warrant for because it's what's deemed abandoned. So detectives take specific items that would gather DNA evidence, like razor blades and toothpicks, and they conduct YSTR testing.
When the DNA tests come back, the results are conclusive.
And lo and behold, it's a match.
Finally, we're able to make a direct connection with Robert Van Wiese to the DNA found at the crime scene. It was surprising to know that a young male coming from the background that he did had the ability to do this at such a young age.
There were no red flags with him. And so it was very unexpected to see him as the actual killer.
We finally had a name. I just totally broke down. And so you're trying to wrap your head around how could an 18-year-old do something like this?
It was shocking because I was 18 myself at the time. I would have never have had that cross my mind. I said, okay, where is he at? Can we get him? And then that's when we learned that he was gone.
Robert Van Wiese is charged with murder and unlawful flight to avoid prosecution, and a warrant is issued for his arrest. Investigators team up with the FBI and launch an international manhunt.
The Van Wiese family owned a lot of properties throughout Mexico. We conducted telephone toll analysis. We looked at financial records. We monitored travel of Van Wiese's family. We did a tremendous amount of ground surveillance on locations where we thought he might be. There were some tips that the FBI received for sightings of Van Wiese in Mexico in certain locations, but we weren't successful in locating him.
Years pass with no sign of Robert, but detectives refuse to quit.
All you want to do is bring the guy back so he can face justice and get some kind of closure for the victims. But even the FBI, we have limited access, limited resources, and Mexico is a big country. there's plenty of places for him to hide.
It is very frustrating because for me, I've lived my entire life waiting for justice, but also very cognizant of the fact that it may never happen.
Then, in 2016, the hunt for Robert Van Wiese takes a promising turn.
Van Wiese had been on the run for 20 years, so I knew it was going to have to be something big for us to find him. And so we discussed it, and we said, let's do it. Let's go for it.
On December 13th, 2016, the FBI places Robert Van Wiese on their top 10 most wanted list.
This was huge for our case because it brings awareness, but also that comes with a $100,000 reward. So it was exciting to know that we're making traction.
Once we announced his addition to the FBI's 10 most wanted list, we again interviewed people that knew him and possibly knew where he was. Probably the most important interview was with Van Wiese's mother. We said, Robert is going to be arrested. He is coming home. The safest way is to turn himself in. I think the mother realized with the $100,000 reward, his name on the 10 most wanted list, that it was going to be insurmountable that he was going to get arrested.
The pressure pays off, and a phone call comes in that changes everything.
Robert Van Wiese's attorney contacted the district attorney's office to let them know that he wants to turn himself in.
33 years after the murder of Lori Stout, her elusive killer, Robert Van Wiese, is ready to return to the U.S. to face justice.
Robert Van Wiese's lawyer contacted the district attorney's office and started to inquire about possible surrender with a plea bargain agreement. Typically speaking, when someone is a fugitive, we do not negotiate. But circumstances in this situation are quite unique. Mexico will not agree to extradite to Texas if the death penalty is on the table. So we will not get him in our hands if he's arrested in Mexico unless we agree to not have death penalty on the table.
Wanting a swift resolution, the district attorney negotiates a deal.
Van Wiese would agree to turn himself in, and they agreed to 30 years in prison.
On January 26, 2017, police head to the Mexican border to meet Robert.
The plan was for him to surrender, but we were holding our breath. We weren't sure it was going to happen.
We're anxious that this is finally going to take place, but until we have Robert Van Wiese in physical custody, we can't let our guard down.
The arrangement was that he would meet us at the halfway point on the pedestrian bridge. There's a line in the middle. On one side says Mexico, on the other side says United States. He was to meet us there at 1 o'clock. He didn't show up.
As the minutes tick by, investigators start to worry they've been duped.
We had assurances from the attorney that he would show up, but at any point during that time, he could have turned around and changed his mind, and there was nothing we could have done.
At 1:36 p.m., a lone figure approaches the border.
He walked up very slowly, stopped at the line. He introduced himself as Robert Van Wiese, and I said to him, "You ready to turn yourself in?" He took a deep breath. He closed his eyes. He said, "Yes." I said, "Step on across." And he took one step over and he was arrested.
Seeing him walk across that bridge and seeing law enforcement put handcuffs on him, it was extremely satisfying.
There had been so much work from so many different people over the years that from 1983 up until 2017, now we have somebody that's accountable and be brought to justice. Was one of the most rewarding experiences in my career.
I sent the picture to Dale and let her know we got him. And I get a text back that it apparently was Dale's birthday. So it was pretty emotional.
She showed me a photo of Van Wiese being escorted into custody. It's kind of hard to believe that after all of these years that it would be that day of all days that he would turn himself in.
It was, and it still is surreal that it finally did happen. I mean, it just emotions everywhere. I just can't, it's finally over. It's finally over. Finally over.
The plea deal means Robert does not have to speak to investigators, leaving them to piece together how they believe the murder unfolded.
He showed up that night to register for classes. He sees Lori as she's cleaning. It's possible that Robert 𝗞𝗶𝗹𝗶𝗶 and Lori Stout had an interaction as he passed her. Maybe she spoke to him. He goes to the bathroom, develops his plan on coming back in.
He's opportunistic, and the opportunity rose, and he left through that fire escape door on the second floor, propped it open.
And once the other workers had all left, I think he came back in.
When he came back in, he would have passed in the parking lot the dumpster that had some leftover electrical wiring that Gary Stout had used that day for the hot water heater, and grabbed it and went upstairs and then attacked her, raped her, and killed her. Lori was killed in probably one of the most personal, violent ways that someone can be killed. Robert 𝗞𝗶𝗹𝗶𝗶 is an extremely cold and calculating person.
On March 28, 2017, Robert pleads guilty to Lori's murder and is sentenced to 30 years in prison. Lori's sister, Beverly, is there to deliver an emotional impact statement.
I looked him right in the eye and told him what he had taken from our family and what it had done. And, I just told him I hope he rots in hell and gets to feel some of that terror that my sister felt that night. I know in my heart he is where he needs to be.
I think Lori's family felt a sense of relief, a sense of closure that maybe now, at least my hope for them now with that is that they could at least start to heal.
Him being arrested and incarcerated does bring closure. I think that that's what everybody dreams about when a crime like this happens to one of their family members.
Still see Lori's face quite often. She was a hoot. Lori was a hoot. I miss her dearly.
I do believe that my life would have been very different if she would have lived. And I know that she would have done anything to make sure that I had what I needed.
I still think of Lori every day, every single day. There were a lot of good times, good memories with Lori, and I just wish we would have had more.